Did you know there are rules you have to follow to correctly place notes in rhythms? This video will show you how. Let's start by looking at how we use quavers in 2/4, 3/4 and 4/4. So the rule behind grouping quavers in 4/4 is that they can be beamed into groups of up to 4. As you can see here, the quavers have been grouped in 2 groups of 4, and you can see this rhythm being used here in Last Song by Alexis French. However, in 4/4, you may see quavers beamed together in pairs to indicate a change of pitch pattern for articulation purposes or for note stem reasons. In doing this, we can see the beats really clearly, but also we can see an example here where they've been beamed in pairs due to articulation purposes. When we look at Allegro moderato from Sonatina in G, we can see the paired quavers, each with a slur, with the second quaver to be played staccato. In 3/4 we can also beam quavers across multiple beats, and here we can see them being beamed across 2 crotchet beats, with this rhythm being used in Journey's End by Heather Hammond. However, in 3/4 we may also see quavers beamed together in pairs for the same reasons as we looked at for 4/4, such as this example in Eine kleine Nachtmusik. In 2/4 quavers can be beamed over multiple beats within a bar. Here we can see the entire bar being beamed together, with this rhythm being used in Rondo alla Turca by Mozart. However, in 2/4 you may also see quavers beamed together in pairs, such as this example from Presto from Sonata in F by Haydn. However, do bear in mind that the choice whether to beam across multiple beats in a bar or to simply beam in beats may also be to do with other factors. Beaming into beats gives clarity for performance, it enables faster sight reading, and it avoids confusing looking rhythms. Composers may beam across multiple beats because they want to show a melodic shape, a syncopated pattern that shouldn't visually be broken, a motif that spans across beats and should be perceived as one idea, or a dance rhythm or groove that isn't aligned with the meter.
What else do I need to know about grouping notes in 4/4?
Now there is a really important rule when grouping quavers in 4/4, and that is that they must not be beamed across beats 2 and 3. We must imagine that there is an invisible line, and beams must not cross this line. We can see this example really clearly in Mozzie by Alyssa Milne.
How do I group notes correctly when I use semiquavers?
When using quavers and semiquavers combined, we should group the notes into beats to make them easy to read. In this example we can clearly see the beats, with 2 semiquavers and a quaver being beamed together 3 times, plus 1 pair of quavers. When using semiquavers in 2/4 we generally see them grouped in 4s. This makes the music really easy to read, such as this example from Sonata in G by Haydn. Here's another example of using semiquavers and quavers in 2/4. Here is the rhythm being used in Musette from the Anna Magdalena Bach book of 1725. And here's another example of beaming into beats. 4 semiquavers beamed together, followed by 2 quavers beamed together, another 2 quavers beamed together, followed by a crotchet. And notice how the 4 quavers in the middle are not beamed across the middle of the bar. And another example of beaming into beats here, in the Allegro of Sonata in G by Haydn. Here's another example of beaming into beats in Air in G by Handel.
What about when I want to use dotted notes?
So when we have dotted quavers and semiquavers, we beam them into beats again. In the rhythm of Diversion No. 5 by Richard Rodney Bennett we can see it really clearly. And here's another example from Beethoven's Andante from Sonata in F minor. Now here's an example in 4/4 where we can clearly see the beats. This rhythm is being used in Figaro's Air by Mozart. And here's another example from the rhythm of the theme of Schindler's List by John Williams. Here's an example where the second half of the bar is beamed together, but the first half of the bar is beamed into 2 beats. This example is taken from Don't Cry for Me, Argentina by Lloyd Webber. However, in 4/4 it is also acceptable to beam patterns of quavers and semiquavers together across 2 beats, and that includes dotted quavers, provided notes are not beamed across the middle of the bar. However, for utmost clarity, it is best to beam together only the notes of a single beat.
What about groupings in 2/2, 3/2 and 4/2?
In time signatures with a minim beat, in 2/2, 3/2 and 4/2, quavers and semiquavers can be beamed into minims. Here is an example of this in a time signature of 2/2, where we have 4 quavers joined together, followed by another 4 quavers joined together, which makes it really clear to see each of the 2 minim beats. This example is taken from a piece called T-Rex Hungry. Here's an example of a piece in 3/2 where we can clearly see the 3 minim beats. This example is taken from the Quran from Bach's Partita No. 4. And finally, here's another example in 4/2 where each minim beat is clearly beamed, being grouped in 4 quavers per minim beat. This rhythm is being used in the 5th prelude by Scriabin.
What about groupings in 3/8?
Now when we come to 3/8, quavers and semiquavers are beamed into bars. This example shows the 3 quavers beamed together, with this rhythm being used in Impromptu No. 4 by Schubert. We can also group quavers and semiquavers together in 3/8, with this rhythm being used in Impromptu No. 4 by Schubert. And here's another example, this time 6 semiquavers being beamed together. Here we can see the rhythm being used in Vivace from Sonatina in G by Clementi.
What about dotted groupings in 3/8?
And the same rule applies if you want to use dotted quavers in 3/8, where we beam everything together. Here's an example of a quaver, a dotted quaver and a semiquaver being beamed together in the rhythm used in Allegretto by Brahms.
How do we group triplets?
When we use triplets, we apply the same rules, that it's best to beam into beats. But remember, in 4/4 we can beam across multiple beats, as long as we don't beam across beats 2 and 3. Here we can see on one half of the bar we have triplet crotchets across beats 1 and 2. The middle of the bar can be seen really clearly, and in the second half of the bar we have a minim across beats 3 and 4. This rhythm is used in Don't Cry for Me Argentina by Lloyd Webber. Remember, in 2/4, quavers and semiquavers are beamed into beats, and the reason for this is to make the music easier to read. Here we can see triplet quavers being beamed together on beat 1, followed by a pair of quavers on beat 2. And here we can see an example of triplets being used in 3/8. Remember, in 3/8 we beam everything together, even when using triplet semiquavers. Here we can see this rhythm being used in Allegro in F by Mozart.
What about rhythms with dotted notes and triplets?
Well, the same rules apply. Triplet semiquavers last for the same value as 2 semiquavers. Remember, it's not as important in 2/4 to be able to see the middle of the bar. And this rhythm here is equivalent to a dotted crotchet followed by a quaver, but the quaver has been split into triplet semiquavers. We are used to seeing a dotted crotchet plus a quaver in 2/4, and this is just a variation on that. Here we can see it being used in Sonata in G by Haydn.
What about grouping rhythms containing demi-semiquavers?
Rhythms using demi-semiquavers can look a little bit more complicated, but we simply apply the same principles as we have done before, where in 2/4, 3/4 and 4/4, quavers and semiquavers are beamed into beats, and we can also add demi-semiquavers onto that. Here we can see the 2 beats extremely clearly, with this rhythm being used in Grandmother Tells a Ghost Story. Here is another example of quavers, semiquavers and demi-semiquavers being beamed together into beats. We can clearly see where they are. This rhythm is used in Allegro from Sonata in G by Haydn. And here we have another example in 3/4, where we can clearly see the 3 beats beamed together. This rhythm is used in Chaconne von J.S. Bach by Brahms. And the same principle as we have already looked at in 3/8 applies with demi-semiquavers, where notes are beamed into bars. Here we can see this rhythm being used in Prelude 10 by Bach.
How do I correctly group notes in a time signature of 4/8?
The time signature of 4/8 really behaves like 4/4, where we must be able to see down the middle of the bar. We must not beam across. So here we can see 1 crotchet beat made up of 2 quavers on one half of the bar and the same rhythm on the other half of the bar. We can see this rhythm being used in Movement 2 of Sonata in 3 by Scriabin. And here's another example, this time with a demi-semiquaver. We can clearly see the 2 halves of the bar. We can not only see the 2 halves of the bar, but we can clearly see where the beats are. This rhythm is being used in Movement 2 of Sonata in 3 by Scriabin.
What about grouping quintuplets and sextuplets?
When it comes to quintuplets and sextuplets, the same rules apply, that we must beam them into beats to make the music easier to read. Here we have an example in 3/4 where we can clearly see the crotchet beats. We have triplet quavers on beat 1, we have a quintuplet on beat 2, and we have a dotted quaver and a semiquaver on beat 3. We can see this rhythm being used in Waltz in A minor by Chopin, and here's an example of a piece using sextuplets, where we can clearly see each beat in turn. with 3 sets of sextuplets on beats 1, 2 and 3 and a crotchet on the final bar.